What were the problems with the most famous ambush in Australian history conducted by one of Australia's most famous battalion commanders? Welcome to episode 13 of the Principles of War podcast, Leadership and Blackjack Galligan. So now that we've finished off with the Principles of War in Malaya, we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at some of the actions that the Australians fought and how leadership impacted on those actions. We'll look at three officers. We're going to look at Lieutenant Bill McCure from the 4th Anti-Tank and his actions at Muir. We're going to look at Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, the CO of the 2nd 19th. We're going to look at the situation that he was placed in, what it was that he did, and how he led his men through what was really quite an impossible situation. Before we get to them, we're going to look at Blackjack Galligan, the CO of the 2nd 30th, and the commander of the troops who were involved with the ambush at Gemas, and that's where we're going to start off with. Before we get to that, though, I want to have a quick look at some of the composition of the 8th Division. So, 8th Division formed on the 4th of July 1940 at Victoria Barracks in Sydney. It was commanded by Major General Vernon Sturdee, who was a regular officer. Now, the interesting story about Sturdee was that he actually accepted a demotion to Major General to command 8th Division. He had been a Lieutenant General. To give you some kind of idea about the expansion that was occurring in the Australian Army, he was promoted from Colonel to Lieutenant General on the 13th of October 1939. He accepted a demotion to take command of 8th Division, but that doesn't last long because on the 13th of August 1940, General Sir Bruddenell White is killed in the Canberra air disaster, and Sturdee is restored to the rank of Lieutenant General and appointed Chief of the General Staff. That leaves the door open for Major General Bennett to take command of 8th Division. Bennett, pretty outspoken officer, had an antipathy towards professional soldiers. He was a veteran of Gallipoli in the Western Front, and he'd actually been the youngest brigade commander in the AIF. The appointment was moderately controversial. A lot of people questioned his fitness for command and his tactical proficiency. He did polarise people. Some people didn't think he was very good. There was a lot of people, though, especially his soldiers, who thought he was terrific. 8th Division, of course, was the third of the divisions to be raised to send troops overseas after the 6th and the 7th had been raised. The three brigade commanders were militia soldiers, and only one of the infantry battalions, the 2nd 26th, was commanded by a regular, and that was Lieutenant Colonel Boys. Now, one interesting fact about the 8th Division is that it actually had more regular officers than the 6th Division, which was the first to be raised. For the new recruits coming in, they tried to impose an age limit between 20 and 35. However, there was one soldier who was actually 14 at the time of enlistment. Obviously, he'd lied about his age. And someone else who'd lied about their age was a veteran of Sudan, and he was at least 70 years old. A third of the new recruits were married, and most of them had never served before. Although, of course, there were veterans from World War I who were willing to serve in World War II. One notable member of that group was Walter Brown, and he was serving in the 2nd 15th Field Regiment, and he was a Victoria Cross recipient. He'd been awarded a Distinguished Conduct Medal for action at Passchendaele, and then on the 6th of July in 1918, he was awarded the Victoria Cross for his work at Villers-Bretonneux. There he captured a machine gun position and took one officer and 11 ORs POW. At the time of enlistment, he was 55 and he lied about his age. He said he was born in 1900 so that he would still be eligible for frontline service. We don't know what happened to Walter Brown. On the 15th of February in 1942 in Singapore, the regiment moved up to the front line to make a final stand. And after the order was given to surrender, he said, "No surrender for me," calmly walked and picked up some grenades and walked towards the enemy positions. Never seen again. Now, 8th Division actually raised 4 infantry brigades, the 22nd, 23rd, 24th and 27th. So the 22nd Brigade, this was the first brigade into Malaya under Brigadier Harold Taylor. the 23rd Brigade under Brigadier Edmund Lind, the 24th under Brigadier Eric Plant, and the 27th, which had Brigadier Duncan Maxwell. And Maxwell's a fascinating character, and we're going to look more at him when we return to Singapore. Now, in a reorganisation of the 2nd AIF, the 24th Brigade was cut across to 9th Division and sent to the Middle East, and 23rd never deployed with the division. It was sent to Darwin, and then its battalions were deployed piecemeal into the Pacific. Rabaul, Timor, Ambon. So this left Bennett with just 2 of his brigades that he would be able to use in Malaya. With growing strategic concerns, the 22nd Brigade was sent to Malaya, and it found it there in mid-February 1941. And this was under the proviso that it would be replaced within a couple of months by British troops. These replacement troops never arrived, and it spent almost a year there on garrison duty and training. As the strategic picture worsened, reinforcements were sent for, and that led Brigadier Maxwell's 27th Brigade being sent to reinforce the 22nd. In the 22nd Brigade, you got the 2nd, 18th, 19th and 20th. So the 18th was led by Lieutenant Colonel Varley. Interestingly enough, his son was a lieutenant in the 2nd, 19th. 2nd, 19th was originally led by Maxwell, and Lieutenant Colonel Anderson took over for him when Maxwell was promoted to become the commander of 27th Brigade. And 2nd 20th, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Jeter. Jeter was replaced by Asherton. Jeter drove his battalion very hard. It was renowned for having the best military skills, but he was never able to form that bond with them, and it was quite a poisonous relationship between Jeter and the battalion, and he was repatriated out with a really bad skin condition, which was exacerbated by a psychological condition. Now, I just want to read an extract from Garth Pratton's Australian Battalion Commanders of the Second World War, because it gives a really interesting illustration of some of the issues that Lieutenant Colonel Jeter had as he was commanding the 2nd 20th. William Jeter of the 2nd 20th provides a prime example of the ineffectiveness of leadership founded on legitimate and coercive power. Jeter refused to entertain ideas contrary to his own and drove rather than led. Brigadier Taylor described him as a slave driver. By the time the 2nd 20th reached Malaya in February 1941, Jeter had lost the confidence of his junior officers owing to his practice of criticising them in front of their troops with little regard for their rank or experience, and regularly undermining their freedom of action. He would not heed the advice of any of his officers regarding training, thereby preventing any sense of trust or mutual respect developing between them. Jeter demanded high standards from his troops, and exhausting tests of endurance were part of the training syllabi. He was not popular. Pratton goes on to give a really good example of one of the indications that his group on command was starting to slip, and that is, in May of 1941, there was 1 court-martial for a soldier in the 2nd 18th, 2 for the 2nd 19th, and 11 for troops in the 2nd 20th. Now, the troops in all the battalions were suffering with the same sort of conditions. The conditions were arduous, it was very hot, the food was not great. And one of the big problems was the fact that they didn't feel that they were actually in the war. So they'd signed up and they were stuck in this backwater of Malaya when 6th and 7th Division were off in the Middle East actually fighting the Germans. And this was one of the issues that led to some of the morale problems in some of the battalions. The sad part about the story of the 2nd 20th was the fact that Brigadier Taylor thought that Jeter was his most knowledgeable CO, and on top of that, the battalion was the most proficient at the elementary skills. He'd done a great job of training them, he just hadn't done a great job of leading them. And that was the tragedy. And in some respects, it was a similar story in the 2nd 30th. This was the battalion led by Lieutenant Colonel Galligan. Now, he was born in 1897 in New South Wales, did his schooling in Newcastle. He'd been in the cadets for 7 years, and in 1916 enlisted in the AIF and was posted to the 34th Battalion. Wounded a couple of times on the Western Front, invalided home in late 1918, discharged in 1919, and he was disappointed that he hadn't received a commission. In 1919, he was commissioned as a lieutenant in the militia, and by 1932, he'd been promoted to lieutenant colonel, and he commanded a succession of battalions. He joined the AIF on the 18th of March 1940, and in October, he took command of the 2nd 30th. Now, he's been described as having a colossal ego, and in a lot of respects, the battalion was an extension of this. And he really did look to create the best battalion. In the early training of the battalion in Bathurst, his soldiers were getting up 1 hour before Rivalry so that they would be able to pass inspection. He set the standard that high. And during the extremely cold winters in Bathurst, where it got below zero, his troops were getting rid of the straw out of their mattresses so that they could be arranged for the morning inspections and be able to pass it. So the standard he was setting was extremely high, and one would have thought probably too high. And he was another CO who was quite comfortable in confronting his officers in front of the troops, and he treated them like naughty schoolboys. He had trouble delegating authority out to his officers and would often micromanage them even after delegating a task to them. He was widely regarded as a tyrant, and he had a reputation as a great ogre, and that was division-wide. One of the issues that he has is while they were training, he actually had a mutiny on his hands. So the troops had just conducted a 3-day exercise. It was quite grueling, and he then organised a snap kit inspection. And the troops refused to take part in it. They believed that they were working harder than all of the battalions. They didn't have a problem with this, and they were proud of it. But they just thought it was nonsense to have a snap kit inspection after a grueling 3-day exercise. He stormed into one section hut and pulled a soldier from his bed. He accused his padre of neglecting his duties, and he attempted to discuss the matter with some of his officers. That didn't go well, so he started ranting and raving at them. He wasn't able to get anywhere, and order was only restored the next morning with negotiations from elected representatives from each of the companies. And I think that highlights the seriousness of the feelings between the troops and Galligan. Now, no mention of this was made to Brigade headquarters, and no charges were laid. And I think that this was because of the fact that he was very conscious of the way that he was viewed by his superiors. Garth Pratton's book has got some amazing examples of the way that Galligan acted while he was in Malaya. On one exercise, which was scripted to demonstrate some tactical principles, he thought it was below the 2nd 30th to lose, which was how the script was meant to play out. So he fought his battalion in a way so that they actually won. And in another one, he disputed the umpire's decision about a war game. Now, that umpire was Anderson of the 2nd 19th, and this was the beginning of an enduring antipathy between the two men. And Pratton highlights the fact that this is part of the hypocrisy of Galligan. So he demanded unquestioning loyalty in his subordinates, but he certainly wasn't offering that up to his superiors. He was extremely unhappy when Maxwell was promoted to of the 27th Brigade, and he greeted Brigadier Maxwell with, "Well, you need not expect me to congratulate you on the red flannel that you're wearing." And then he went straight to Bennett to complain about it. He threatened to resign and to return to Australia. Now, Bennett understood what Galligan was about, and he never took the threat seriously. However, there were those on the divisional staff who thought that, well, if Galligan felt so strongly about it, then maybe he would be better off returning to Australia. And I think that this is because of the fact that they realised it was difficult to work with him. So one of the questions is, why didn't Galligan go the same way of Jeter? Why was he able to build a strong battalion? And I think some components of that are the people that were around him. His adjutant, his company commanders acted as a buffer between Galligan and the troops, and most importantly, his 2IC, Gentleman George, he was known as. and that's Major George Ramsay. He was the perfect counter to Galligan's brash, abrasive nature, and he's described as even-tempered, unshakable, and attentive. One company commander said that old Blackjack would dress us down and George would come and cheer them up until tomorrow when they'd get bashed down again. He was incredibly loyal to the battalion and to Galligan, despite being incredibly frustrated by Galligan's faults. He wanted to present himself to everyone as a hard bastard, but a lot of that was show. Unlike some leaders, when the troops walked, he would drive. He rarely participated in the harsh exercises that he set for his men, and he ate, smoked and drank often to excess. He got into the AIF with a medical waiver because he wasn't fit enough to meet the standards. However, he refused that luxury to anyone in the battalion. He told his troops that anyone reporting sick to the MO would be out of the 2nd 30th, and he demanded the same thing for anyone who fainted on parade. Now, the interesting thing is that after the war, there was fierce loyalty to Galligan, and a lot of that is of the way that he managed the troops in the POW camp at Changi. And Pratton suggests that it's also a component of transference from loyalty to the battalion is transferred into becoming loyalty to Galligan. He created a cohesive battalion by putting them through the crucible of having him as a leader and subjecting them to such harsh treatment. An interesting demonstration of that cohesion is the fact that the battalion en masse conducted the mutiny. So he had melded the battalion into a cohesive unit, and that cohesive unit then exercised its cohesion by mutinying en masse against the way that he was treating them. Now, this brings us to the ambush at Gemas. Bennett and Maxwell had been looking for a suitable site for a battalion-level ambush. What they wanted to do was to destroy an entire regiment, but however, the biggest issue that they faced was the ability to find suitable terrain where command and control could be exercised over an ambush over such a large distance. They weren't able to find anywhere that was suitable, so they scaled back their intent to the execution of a company ambush. Galligan was also conducting recon, and it's said that he travelled over 1,000 miles in one 4-day period in early January trying to find a battalion or company position that was suitable for the ambush. In preparation for the ambush, one of the actions taken to shape the Japanese into the kind of action that they wanted was that there was only one bridge destroyed as the 3rd Indian Corps retreated from Kuala Lumpur. This lowered the defences of the Japanese as they advanced. The increase in speed of advance drew out their lines of support and isolated the forward units. By 11th of January, with retreating 3rd Indian Corps vehicles streaming by, a 2nd 30th was set in the engagement area. Morale was high and the lads were spoiling for a fight. The location that they chose was a small wooden bridge over the Gemencheh River, 12 kilometres west of Gemas. Once over the bridge, the Japanese would ride through 30 metres of flat ground before entering 3 cuttings around 40 metres long, with 4 metre almost perpendicular walls with thick overhanging vegetation. Lots were drawn and Captain Desmond Duffy's Bravo Company was chosen to actually execute the ambush. They moved into the actual positions in the afternoon of the 13th of January, and he sighted the ambush with 1 platoon firing across the bridge and 2 platoons situated on both sides of the ambush. So the walls of the defile were so high that troops were firing actually down onto the Japanese rather than across. So he was able to have troops on both sides of the ambush site. And at 1600 on the 14th, Captain Duffy whispered into the field telephone, "Enemy cyclists moving through," as he lay 50 metres from the bridge crossing the Gemencheh River. This was the vanguard of the Mukaide Detachment that was riding by. One group of bike riders passed by, followed by 3 motorcycles, then another stream of bike riders. He was waiting for infantry and trucks, but after more than 250 riders had gone by, he couldn't wait any longer. He ordered Lieutenant Arthur Watchhorn of the 2nd 15th Field Company to blow the bridge, and the ambush was initiated. The 2 platoons on either side of the engagement area opened up with small arms and grenades, creating mass carnage in the engagement area. The platoon, looking across the bridge, opened up with its Bren guns, and more casualties were caused over on the other side of the bridge, firing in enfilade, than in the actual engagement area. Now, the intent of the ambush was for the artillery to attack the 2.5 kilometres of road north of the bridge, but there was a couple of problems. Poorly hidden comms cable was spotted by the Japanese after the ambush had been initiated, and they cut that cable. Galligan had forbidden the use of radios because of his fears that the Japanese were using direction-finding equipment, which they weren't. He also vetoed the plan of the battery commander to have a dispatch rider at the forward listening post to inform when the ambush had been initiated. The only backup to the comms cable between the ambush commander and battalion headquarters was a civilian telephone line, and that was also cut by the Japanese. The headquarters was 6 kilometres behind the ambush site, and the jungle swallowed up the sound of the fighting. After 60 minutes after hearing that Japanese were moving through the engagement area, Galligan still denied the artillery the opportunity to fire on the road. The ambush had only lasted 20 minutes, and this is the big problem with the ambush at Gemas. Once the bridge was blown, the Japanese troops started banking up on the western side. The only casualties they were suffering was from the Bren guns, and they were creating carnage on the far side of the river. What could have been so much more significant was denied Galligan because he wasn't able to seize the initiative and to use the guns as planned on the troops as they bunched up on the far side of the river. Now, the withdrawal from the ambush site was quite difficult. One of the platoons had to move through the engagement area to link up with the rest of the company, and a lot of Japanese troops had already gone through the engagement area. So they had started to double back, and the company started receiving small arms fire. The Japanese 9th Infantry Brigade reported that it had suffered 70 dead and 57 wounded in the ambush. The advance was resumed in an hour, and the bridge was repaired in 6 hours using timber from a local timber mill. So what was planned as a significant stop to the Japanese advance really was nothing more than a bump in the road. One of the recurrent themes of Australian operations in Malaya is this lack of regard for wireless communications. Many had concerns about the reliability of it, and there was a frequent concern around headquarters being located by Japanese direction-finding equipment. Often wireless communication was discouraged, sometimes it was even banned. And Galligan was probably one of the worst offenders. He actually abandoned all of his wireless equipment. After the campaign, the Chief Signal Officer for 8th Division noted that the disregard for wireless communications meant that unit commanders were often out of communication for critical periods of the battles, both in Malaya and in Singapore. And this caused confusion and avoidable casualties. In Singapore, communications once the comms cable was cut, communications between the artillery and the forward observers was done with either flares or liaison officer, which is really quite archaic and harkens back to the early days of World War I. Now, Galligan gets compared unfavourably to Anderson for lacking moral courage, so he wasn't able to seize the initiative, he wasn't able to get his guns to engage as a part of the coordination of the ambush, which for me I find puzzling because of the fact that it wasn't a question of troop safety. He had no troops on the far side of the river, so he could have quite easily engaged the Japanese as they bunched up in front of the blown bridge. The next day, as the battalion was retreating in the face of a Japanese advance, once again he refused to use his artillery, despite the urging of the artillery officer attached to his headquarters, because some elements of two of his companies were still forward of the main position. And there were questions about his physical fitness and endurance under the strain of command during the retreat. He was seen crying during the retreat from Gemas, and Pratton goes on to mention that Maxwell recalled that he rather cracked up during the withdrawal from Namasi estate. And by the time the 2nd 30th reached Singapore, his assistant adjutant astutely noted, "The old aggressive spirit was subdued, and I've often wondered whether this was only because he was ill, or was it because he shrunk from the possible butchery of his battalion when the rested and revived Japanese hit us." The strain of leadership during the retreat definitely took its toll on him. There was an incident where an irritant smoke used by the Japanese caused some of Galligan's men to break off an attack at Namasi estate on the 28th of January. And he actually drew his revolver on the retreating troops and threatened to shoot anybody who went further back. When Galligan returned to Australia, he said to his men that he wanted them to return to Australia as soldiers, not as prisoners of war. And after the war, he refused to be associated with any of the prisoner of war associations. And I don't really want to dwell on the things that happened in Changi or on the Burma Railroad, but I do think it's important to make one mention of it. And I think that in a lot of respects, Galligan came into his own as the commander of the Australian troops at Changi. The way that he acted may not have endeared him to his men, but it certainly created a good relationship with the Japanese. They certainly respected him, and he was able to use his position to ensure that the troops were treated as best as possible at Changi. There was one occasion where he upbraided a Japanese soldier for the condition of his uniform and said, "What would the Emperor think of you with this uniform?" And the Japanese soldier actually asked for help from the Australians to ensure that his uniform was of an appropriate standard. That kind of relationship in a prisoner of war camp with the guards is invaluable and certainly led to significantly less casualties in Changi than could have been the case. So with Blackjack, he aimed for the hard bastard kind of persona. He wanted to be the hard-driving CO. He wanted to create a great battalion, and in a lot of respects he did. But there was a couple of things that were missing. Firstly, there was the issue around his own physical fitness, and I think that this is important. As the campaign continued on, what would his performance have been like had he been fitter, had he been better able to handle the arduous conditions of serving in Malaya? And the moral courage. On a couple of occasions, he was found wanting. Was it moral courage, or was it more the ability to seize that initiative? So not engaging with the guns after the ambush had been triggered at Gemas significantly detracted from the effectiveness of that. And in fact, the Japanese were on the advance within an hour, when realistically a lot more casualties could have been inflicted and significantly more time could have been bought for the withdrawal. But in command of the POW camp, or the Australians in the POW camp at Changi, he did a sterling job. So that's it for the story of Blackjack. We're going to move on in the next podcast to look at Lieutenant Bill McClure of the 4th Anti-Tank. And this is the next engagement that the Australians were involved with in the retreat as a part of the Moore campaign.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.